just one good birthday.
He thought he was protecting a birthday.
No, please.
He thought he was crushing a birthday cake.
Hail Meridian.
The billionaire thought he destroyed a birthday. He had no idea who he had just humiliated.
You were right all along. This could bring them all down. Then send it.
The billionaire destroyed a cake.
It's over. The day he crushed that birthday cake was the day his empire began to fall.
The cake cost $18. For Warren Tate, that was everything he had left. The last bills from a coat pocket after months of sleeping in a truck on Figueroa Street. He had counted the money 3 times before stepping into the small bakery. He just wanted one decent thing for his daughter's birthday. He was crossing the hotel entrance when Preston Hale's shoulder caught his arm, and the white box hit the marble floor. Preston looked at the worn jacket, the scuffed shoes, the man on one knee, and pressed his heel into the top of the box. "Get this trash out of the entrance," he said. Warren didn't answer. He only looked at the logo on Preston's lapel, Hail Meridian. 7 days later, that $2 billion company began to fall. Never dismiss the man who has lost everything, because sometimes he is the only one still holding the truth that can bring you down. The bakery was called Briggs & Bloom, and it sat wedged between a dry cleaner and a check-cashing office on 5th Street in downtown Los Angeles, far enough from the glass tower hotels that most people passing through the neighborhood never thought to slow down. Fallon Briggs had opened it 9 years earlier, with a modest amount of savings and a second-hand convection oven, and she ran it alone most mornings, mixing batter, piping names in careful cursive onto cakes, humming along to whatever played through the small speaker bolted above her sink. It was not the kind of bakery that appeared in lifestyle publications or earned a mention in city guides, but it was steady and warm, and the people who came through her door were mostly regulars, nurses from the hospital 2 blocks over, maintenance workers from the arena on the far side of the lot, a few older women who arrived on Thursdays specifically for the lemon pound cake and stayed to talk. Fallon had been making cakes long enough to know the difference between a customer who was in a hurry and one who was spending their last good money on something that mattered, and she had learned that the second kind rarely announced themselves. Warren Tate walked in at 10:15 on a Thursday morning in late October, and Fallon understood within the first minute which kind of customer he was. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulders, with close-cropped gray hair and careful, deliberate movements, the movements of someone who had learned not to knock things over in small spaces. His dark canvas field coat was clean but thin at the elbows, and the collar was turned up against the October chill, in the particular way of a person whose lining had long since stopped doing its job. He looked at the birthday cakes in the display case, the small ones, single layer, nothing elaborate. And when Fallon named the price, she saw his hand go briefly to his coat pocket, in the way people do when they are silently recounting what they have. She told him there was a discount that morning. On one of the smaller cakes, a minor frosting imperfection along the base that was barely visible to anyone who wasn't looking for it, which was technically true, though she had not marked it down until she saw the way he was studying the case. He chose the white cake with yellow roses piped along the border and asked if she could write "Happy Birthday Brielle" across the top, spelling the name out slowly to make sure she had it right. When Fallon handed over the box, he held it with both hands, level and careful, the way a person holds something they cannot afford to drop, and he thanked her twice, once at the counter and once at the door, a small formality that cost him nothing but which he offered anyway. Without her asking, he mentioned that his daughter was a night shift nurse, who had been working double shifts for 3 months without taking a day off, that she hadn't stopped long enough to let anyone do something nice for her, and that she deserved a decent birthday. Fallon said she agreed. Warren pushed through the glass door, stepped into the gray October light, and crossed the sidewalk in the direction of the Grand Palomar Hotel, holding the box with steady hands, not hurrying. Above the hotel's brass entrance, a large blue and silver banner read, Meridian Investor Summit. Partnership Beyond Borders. He was not going to the summit. He was cutting through the hotel's side entrance to reach the public parking lot on the far side of the block, where his truck had been sitting in the same corner spot for 3 days. The truck was a 2004 Chevrolet Silverado, slate gray, with a cracked passenger side mirror, and a sleeping bag folded across the back seat beneath a length of canvas tarp. Warren had been living in it for 4 months, since the last of the sublease money ran out, and before that, since the savings had been transferred in installments to a lawyer who had ultimately been able to do nothing for him. He had told Brielle he was between apartments, staying with a friend from the old neighborhood, and Brielle, who worked nights and trusted her father without requiring his details to be confirmed, had chosen to believe him, which is not always the same as not knowing. He did not want her to know. That was the whole point of the cake, not to pretend everything was fine, but to give her 1 hour at her small kitchen table, with candles and coffee, where she could feel like her father was still her father, and not a problem she was going to have to solve. He was halfway across the hotel entrance, the box held level in both hands, when the crowd compressed, a cluster of men in dark suits emerging from the revolving door, and Warren was pushed slightly off balance just as Preston Hale stepped from the lead vehicle of a black car convoy at the curb. Preston Hale was the kind of man who had never learned to move around other people. At 48, he had been the center of rooms for long enough that he expected the space around him to rearrange itself without any particular effort on his part, and in most rooms it did. His assistant walked ahead. His security created clearance. His communications director, Meredith Langston, managed every variable between his car door and the event stage. He had the bearing of someone who had never stopped being told he was exceptional, and this combination produced a particular kind of arrogance, not angry by nature, but quickly vicious when interrupted. This morning he was running 7 minutes behind schedule, and the Hale Meridian Investor Summit was the most important public event the company had hosted in 4 years. A formal announcement of a cross-continental logistics partnership that would, according to his team's projections, position the company for a secondary market listing and cement Preston's standing as one of the most influential figures in private sector infrastructure in the western United States. 7 minutes mattered. He came through the revolving door at pace, Meredith half a step behind running a final review on her tablet. 2 communications staff flanking them with clipboards and earpieces. The crowd near the entrance was larger than it should have been, arriving guests, hotel staff moving luggage, a few pedestrians using the lobby as a cut-through. Warren was among them, navigating toward the side exit with the bakery box level in both hands. When the 2 men met, Warren's elbow catching Preston's shoulder as the crowd compressed, the box slipped, glanced off the edge of the entry mat, and landed flat on the marble floor. The lid came partially loose. The top of the cake, Happy Birthday Brielle, in yellow frosting, was visible through the gap, slightly smeared. Preston stopped. He looked at the box, then at Warren, performing the kind of rapid assessment that takes less than 2 seconds and communicates everything. The worn jacket, the fraying collar, the scuffed shoes, the age and posture of a man whose circumstances were legible at a glance. Meredith said under her breath, "Preston, we're late." Preston did not move. Instead, he looked at Warren the way a person looks at something they find mildly offensive. Not enraged, not particularly engaged, just inconvenienced in a way that seemed to require acknowledgement. "Watch where you're going," he said. Warren was already bending to retrieve the box. "I'm sorry," Warren said quietly, not because he believed the collision was primarily his fault, but because those 2 words had cost him nothing in the past and sometimes prevented what came next. They did not prevent it this time. Preston looked at the box, at the smear of frosting visible through the open lid, and at the faint mark the cardboard had left on the toe of his right shoe. Italian leather, the kind that costs more than a month of Warren's last good salary. "You walked into a $400 hotel entrance carrying bakery food," Preston said loudly enough that the guests near the door turned. Meredith touched his arm. He moved his foot deliberately over the top of the box. Warren still kneeling, still holding it, and pressed down with the unhurried deliberateness of a man who understands that the cruelest thing is not the act, but the pace of it. The lid gave, the frosting smeared, the name Brielle folded under the cardboard and disappeared. "Get this out of the entrance," Preston said. "You're obstructing foot traffic." A few guests near the door laughed. One of the communications staff turned away. Warren remained on one knee for a moment after Preston had already moved past, looking at the crushed box in his hands, at the ruined writing, at $18 of birthday cake pressed into something that no longer resembled a cake. Fallon had come to her bakery entrance when the quality of the noise outside changed. She could hear it shift through the glass, the particular register of a crowd responding to something that made them uncertain whether to intervene. She pushed through the door. She had seen the last of it. The man on one knee, the collapsed box, the group moving through the hotel entrance as if the ground behind them were simply clean. She crossed the sidewalk quickly and came to Warren's side. "Hey," she said. "Are you okay?" Warren stood. He looked at the box once more. Then he looked at the banner above the hotel entrance. Hail Meridian, the Navy logo on silver fabric. And he looked at it a second time, and a third, and something in his face settled into the particular stillness of a person who has just understood something important that they were not sure they still had the right to act on. Fallon walked him back inside and made him coffee without asking. She set it in front of him at the small table near the window, and then went to the back to begin assembling a replacement cake. Same size, same white frosting, same yellow roses. Because she needed to do something with her hands, and because the man sitting at her table was holding a very old kind of hurt with the practiced stillness of someone who had been holding it for years. Warren wrapped both hands around the mug and said, "You don't have to do that." Fallon said, "I know." They sat for a few minutes in the quiet of the bakery, the radio low, the smell of warm butter, the muffled sound of traffic outside, and Warren said, without bitterness and without particular drama, that it wasn't the first time he had been treated as if he weren't there. He said it in the flat tone of a man recounting weather patterns, and that flatness told Fallon more about the depth of it than any other description could have. What Fallon did not know, and what most people who saw Warren Tate on 5th Street would never have guessed from the canvas coat or the truck, or the careful way he accepted a discount on a birthday cake, was that 9 years earlier, Warren had sat at a very different kind of table, a conference table on the 14th floor of a risk management firm in Century City, and had presented a 47-page audit report detailing systematic irregularities in the supplier invoicing and contract documentation of a mid-sized logistics company in the process of rebranding itself as a technology-forward infrastructure platform. The company was called Meridian Supply Networks at the time. 2 years later, after a successful rebrand and a substantial infusion of private capital, it became Hail Meridian. Warren had been a senior risk audit specialist and co-founder of a small consulting firm that had taken the Meridian account as a growth engagement, and what his audit had revealed was not ambiguous. Inflated vendor billings, contracts awarded to shell entities with no verifiable operational infrastructure, and revenue figures that bore only a passing relationship to the actual movement of goods through the company's supply chain. He had brought the report to his senior partners, then to the company's internal legal team, then through a formal channel to the financial oversight body, with jurisdiction over the company's public-facing disclosures. Each time, the documentation had been received, acknowledged, and then absorbed and neutralized through maneuvers Warren had not fully understood at the time but understood very well afterward. His firm lost the Meridian account. A counter-complaint appeared, alleging that Warren's audit had been conducted improperly, and that his conclusions were the product of a professional dispute, rather than legitimate findings. His firm's insurance carrier settled to avoid litigation. His partners dissolved the engagement. Warren fought the counter-complaint for 14 months, spent everything he had, and ultimately accepted a negotiated resolution, requiring him to acknowledge procedural irregularities without admitting to the underlying allegations. A sentence in a legal document that meant nothing to anyone reading carefully, but meant everything to anyone deciding whether to hire him. He had kept the original documents. All of them. The audit report, the internal emails forwarded to him before the account was closed, the vendor contracts with the identifying anomalies highlighted, the supplier agreements that could not be reconciled with the shipping records. He kept them in a fireproof document box in the back of the truck, wrapped in a plastic sleeve, under the spare tire cover. He had looked at them twice in the past 4 years and put them away both times, telling himself the moment had passed, that the quiet war was over, and Preston had won it, and reopening it would cost Warren more than it would cost Preston. Standing on the sidewalk with the crushed box in his hands, looking at the Hail Meridian banner above the hotel entrance, he did the arithmetic again and arrived at a different result. He called Sterling Quinn from the parking lot. Sterling picked up on the third ring. Warren said, "I think it's time to open the Hail Meridian file." Sterling was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'll be at Rosita's at 8. Inside the Grand Palomar, Preston Hale had already forgotten Warren Tate. He had moved past the entrance incident the way a person moves past a pothole. Registered briefly, navigated around, no longer relevant. And by the time he reached the backstage corridor of the Grand Meridian Ballroom, he was running through his opening remarks with Meredith, adjusting the cadence of 2 paragraphs, asking her to move the infrastructure slide earlier in the presentation. The Hail Meridian Investor Summit had been described in the advance materials distributed to more than 200 institutional stakeholders as a landmark moment in the company's evolution from regional logistics coordinator to cross-border infrastructure partner. It was also, though the advance materials did not describe it in these terms, the event at which Preston intended to finalize verbal commitments from 3 major institutional investors, whose combined capital represented the bridge the company needed to sustain its current valuation until a secondary listing could be completed. The ballroom held more than 400 that morning. Analysts, fund managers, mid-tier press, a delegation from a Midwestern infrastructure consortium, and the category of attendee who appears on event rosters but rarely asks direct questions. Meredith had engineered the guest list over 6 weeks, calibrating the room's composition so that enthusiasm was visibly distributed and skepticism was seated at the back. She was good at this. She had been managing Preston's public face for 11 years and had developed a specific skill for making rooms feel inevitable, like the announcement was something that had already happened, and everyone had simply gathered to celebrate its confirmation. Preston walked on stage to applause that was substantial if not entirely spontaneous, and gave the kind of address he had given dozens of times. Part corporate vision, part personal mythology, built around the technique of presenting his company's growth as a direct consequence of his commitment to disrupting legacy infrastructure inefficiencies. He was persuasive in the way of someone who has given the same essential speech, often enough that he no longer has to think about it, which frees him to perform the version of sincerity that plays better than the real thing. Somewhere in the middle of the address, he made a brief joke about a minor street-level inconvenience on the way in this morning. And a few people in the front rows laughed, and Meredith, watching from the wing, made a small notation on her tablet. What Meredith had not yet told Preston, because she had not fully processed its significance, was that earlier that morning, before the summit began, a member of the investor relations team had forwarded her an email thread flagged in the due diligence queue. The flag was on a vendor contract name that had surfaced in a background search. The name attached to the flag was Warren Tate. Meredith had seen the name before, years ago, in the context of a legal settlement she had been told at the time was a nuisance matter from a disgruntled contractor. Fully resolved and of no further consequence, she had placed this new email in the same folder and returned her attention to the summit. The company's CFO, Gerald Marsh, had also seen the flag and had printed a copy of the email and placed it in a folder in his desk drawer, where it sat through the remainder of the summit, like something with a slow and particular kind of patience. In the parking lot 4 floors below the ballroom, accessible from the side street, Warren Tate was opening a fireproof document box in the back seat of his truck, setting each folder carefully on the passenger seat with the attention of a man handling evidence he has spent years keeping intact. Rosita's diner sat on Olympic Boulevard, far enough from the hotel corridor that no one from the Hale Meridian summit was likely to pass through its door that evening. Sterling Quinn arrived first and slid into the corner booth with the economy of a man who had spent 4 decades practicing the art of being in rooms without drawing attention to himself. He was 66, lean and unhurried, with the quiet authority that comes not from status, but from having been in enough genuinely difficult situations to know which details matter and which are theater. He had represented Warren through the original counter-complaint proceedings and had watched the case collapse. Not because Warren was wrong, but because Warren had run out of money before Preston ran out of lawyers, and he had carried that outcome in the way good attorneys carry the cases they believe they should have won. Warren arrived 11 minutes later and set the document box on the table between them. He ordered black coffee and did not touch it. Sterling opened the box. What Sterling reviewed that night, over nearly 3 hours at a corner table in a diner with a cracked vinyl booth, was a document record that had not materially changed since Warren had assembled it 9 years earlier, but whose relevance had shifted considerably in the time between. There were 4 primary categories of evidence. The first was the formal audit report, 47 pages, bound with Warren's original cover sheet, annotated in the margins in precise and unhurried handwriting, identifying 17 specific instances of vendor billing irregularities across a 14-month period, with a total discrepancy between invoiced amounts and verifiable delivery records of approximately $6 million. The second category comprised more than 30 internal emails forwarded to Warren during the active engagement, several of which contained explicit instructions from a senior financial officer to adjust reconciliation entries before external review. The third category was a set of supplier contracts, complete originals, entered into with entities sharing registered addresses, with no verifiable operational infrastructure, whose principals were, in 2 cases, relatives of company executives. The fourth category was the most recent and the most significant, a set of financial projections used in the current Investor Summit materials, obtained through standard public disclosure channels that bore a structural resemblance to the inflated figures which Warren had documented nearly a decade earlier. The same pattern of vendor offset revenue recognition that had been the central finding of the original audit. Sterling looked up from the last folder. "They're still doing it," he said. "Differently, but structurally the same." Warren said nothing, because he had already known this. Sterling asked why he had waited, why, with this file intact, he had not moved sooner. Warren was quiet for a moment. He said he had a daughter who was trying to build a life, and every time he had considered reopening the file, he had thought about what the process would cost her. The exposure, the way people look at the family of a person who becomes a story about corporate fraud, the grinding cost of being attached to something that takes years to resolve and never fully does. He said he had made his peace with being the man who knew and said nothing, because the alternative, being the man who knew and said something and lost again, was a price he had paid once and was not sure he could afford to pay twice. Sterling asked what had changed. Warren did not mention the hotel entrance or the marble floor or the crushed cake. He said, "I looked at the logo and remembered who I was before I decided to be quiet." Sterling nodded. He did not ask for more, because he had been a lawyer long enough to understand that the reasons people act are rarely as simple as the reasons they give, and rarely as complicated as the reasons they withhold. Sterling spent the following morning preparing a submission package, the original audit documentation, a structured analysis of the current projection discrepancies, and a formal complaint letter, and sent it by encrypted courier to 2 recipients, a senior investigative editor at a regional financial journal, and the regional office of the financial oversight body that had, 9 years earlier, acknowledged Warren's original report and done nothing with it. He sent a third copy to the principal of an independent forensic accounting firm, whose reputation for methodical, politically neutral analysis was as close to unimpeachable as anything in that field reliably gets. The article appeared the following morning on the Financial Journal's publication at 6:47, under a headline that was careful and specific, and did not contain Preston's name, only the company name and the phrase, historical audit discrepancies. Preston read it at 7:15 in his Bel Air home office and called Meredith, using language not suitable for any professional environment. Meredith, who had been awake since 5 and had already read the article 3 times, told him to stay off the phone until she had assessed the source, the distribution reach, and the likely follow-up trajectory. Preston told her to kill it. Meredith told him that was not how financial journalism worked. Preston told her to make it work that way. The article itself was modest in scope, 4 paragraphs, heavy on language like reportedly, and sources familiar with the matter, citing no specific document by name. But it contained one sentence that Meredith recognized immediately as the kind that does not appear in a financial story unless someone has seen something real. The sentence read, "Sources indicate that concerns about vendor contract documentation at Meridian Supply Networks, the predecessor entity to Hale Meridian, were raised by at least one independent auditor and formally submitted to financial regulators as early as 9 years prior to the company's current investor activity." One sentence. But it contained the phrase, "formally submitted to financial regulators," and that phrase implied a paper trail that did not disappear because you had once decided to ignore it. By 10 that morning, 2 of the institutional investors who had been in the summit ballroom sent formal inquiries to the investor relations desk, requesting documentation on the company's vendor contract audit history and the methodology used in the current revenue projections. The CFO, Gerald Marsh, a cautious man who had spent 6 years at the company, quietly worried about exactly this kind of exposure, came to Preston's office at 11, closed the door behind him, and told Preston that the investor inquiries were written in the language of legal counsel and that the company's outside attorneys needed to be looped in before the end of the business day. Preston leaned back in his chair and said quietly, "Warren Tate." Gerald said the name had appeared in the preliminary source assessment. Preston looked at the city through the window and said, almost to himself, he couldn't even hold on to a birthday cake. Gerald said nothing. Preston said, "Reach out to Sterling Quinn's office. Find out what they have." Sterling Quinn did not take the call. By the end of the second day, the article had been picked up by 3 additional financial outlets, one of which had its own investigative desk and began making independent inquiries. By the end of the 3rd day, the largest of the institutional investors, a fund with a standing policy of suspending commitments during any active regulatory inquiry period, sent a formal notice to Hale Meridian's investor relations team, stating that its partnership discussions were being placed on hold pending a satisfactory response to the documentation requests. The company's internal valuation model, built on the assumption that this fund's commitment would be confirmed by the end of the summit week, began to show stress fractures that the financial team could see clearly, and that the communications team was working, with declining success, to prevent from becoming visible outside the company. Meredith launched a counter-narrative effort on the 3rd morning. A formal statement from Preston denying the substance of the allegations, describing the original audit as a contractual dispute resolved through proper legal channels years ago, and characterizing the current coverage as an attempt by interested parties to disrupt a landmark partnership announcement. Preston appeared in a short video interview on a business news program, composed and precise, using the language of a man who had been briefed carefully and who believed, or had convinced himself, that the force of his own credibility was sufficient to hold a story in place. For approximately 18 hours, it appeared to work. What shifted the second news cycle was not a document. It was a phone video, 22 seconds long, shot through the glass of a bakery door by a customer, who had happened to be near the entrance at the moment of the summit, and had filmed it without much forethought. The video showed from behind and slightly to one side a man in a dark canvas coat carrying a white bakery box, and then the box on the marble floor, and then a figure in a well-cut suit pressing a foot deliberately down onto the box while the first man was still holding it. No audio, no caption, no context required. The image of a prominent CEO stepping on a birthday cake belonging to a man in a worn coat reached an audience that financial journalism had not. People who could not parse a vendor contract irregularity could understand a foot coming down on a white box. The reaction across news story threads was not straightforward outrage. It was recognition, the feeling of having seen something before and knowing immediately what it reveals about the person who did it. Preston's communications team issued a statement saying the video lacked context and that the encounter had been accidental. The statement improved nothing. Meredith told Preston the video had given the financial story a human face and that human faces are harder to deny than spreadsheet anomalies. Preston told her a man living out of a truck could not bring down a $2 billion company. Meredith looked at the updated investor inquiry count and said nothing. On the fourth morning, a reporter from a large market investigative publication contacted Warren through Sterling Quinn's office. She was thorough and calm and asked only the questions she had already partially answered through her own research. She asked if Warren was the same Warren Tate who had submitted an audit report to the oversight body 9 years earlier regarding what was then called Meridian Supply Networks. Warren said he was. She asked if he still held the original documentation. Warren said he did. She asked if he was willing to go on record. He said yes. The investigation article that ran 48 hours later was not written in a hurry. The reporter had spent the intervening 2 days cross-referencing the documents Sterling had submitted with the company's own filing history, pulling the regulatory acknowledgement letters that confirmed the original complaint had been received, locating the court records from the counter-complaint proceedings, and interviewing former employees who gave background statements on the condition of anonymity. The resulting piece was thorough and economical, and contained independently verified facts that, taken separately, were each damaging, and taken together formed the kind of evidentiary structure that is very difficult to deny without the denial becoming its own story. The article's central finding was straightforward. Warren Tate, a former risk audit specialist who had flagged serious financial irregularities at Meridian Supply Networks 9 years earlier, had subsequently been targeted by a counter-complaint that appeared to have been coordinated through the company's legal team, had lost his professional standing as a direct result, and had been living in economic hardship for years while the company he had reported on continued to operate and grow using financial structures materially similar to those he had originally documented. The article also noted, with the careful understatement that characterizes this kind of journalism, that Warren Tate had recently come to broader public attention in connection with a video taken outside the Grand Palomar Hotel on the morning of the Hale Meridian Investor Summit. Brielle Tate read the article on her phone during her lunch break in the hospital cafeteria. She read it twice, then called her father. He answered on the second ring. She said, "Dad?" He said, "I know." She said, "You've been sleeping in your truck." He said, "I didn't want you to worry." She said, "How long?" He said, "A while." There was a silence between them that was not anger, but something older and more complicated. The silence of a grown child, realizing that the parent they thought they knew has been carrying a weight they were never shown, and trying to hold the love and the grief of that discovery at the same time without putting either one down. Brielle took the rest of the day off and drove to the gas station on Figueroa. She had not been to that part of the city in months, and she sat in her car for a moment after pulling up alongside the gray Silverado, looking at the sleeping bag visible through the rear window, and then she got out and knocked on the passenger door. Warren opened it. She looked at the document box on the seat, the organized folders, the careful arrangement of a life inside a small space, and she said, finally, "I'm not ashamed that we're poor, Dad. I'm only sad you did this alone." Warren looked at his hands. He said he had not wanted to be a burden to her when she was just beginning to build something. She said the only thing that felt like a burden was the thought of him deciding on her behalf what she could and couldn't handle. They drove to Sterling's office that afternoon, and Warren gave a formal recorded statement corroborating every element of the investigation and adding specific details the reporter had not had access to. Brielle stood in the parking lot afterward, watching her father talk with Sterling by the entrance, and she thought about the box, the yellow roses, the name and frosting, the way he had carried it with both hands, like it was something fragile and worth protecting, because it was. On the fourth and fifth days, the Hale Meridian collapse moved from the press into institutional machinery. The oversight body issued a formal document request. Not a subpoena yet, but the kind of communication that causes every attorney at a company to stop and rearrange their priorities. The three major institutional investors either suspended their commitments or stopped responding to the investor relations team entirely. Two of the company's major banking relationships placed its credit facilities under formal review, which meant in practical terms that the line of credit the company relied on for quarterly operational liquidity was no longer accessible without explicit approval from a credit committee, not scheduled to meet for 10 days. Gerald Marsh sent Preston a memo on the morning of the fifth day. It was 6 pages, methodical, and contained a sentence near the end that Preston read 3 times. The company does not currently have the liquidity to sustain normal operations through the end of the quarter without the release of the credit facility or the confirmation of at least one of the suspended investor commitments. Preston called his outside attorneys. He called the board chair. He called his personal financial advisor. He did not call Meredith, because Meredith had stopped answering his direct line and was routing all communications through her assistant. What Meredith was doing that morning was sitting across from her own attorney in a conference room on Wilshire Boulevard, reviewing the boundary between what she had known, when she had known it, and what she could demonstrate she had been instructed to disregard. She had kept her own records. Not for this purpose exactly, but the way people keep records when they work for someone who moves fast and changes his story. She was beginning to understand she would need to use them. Preston arrived at the conclusion, late, and through the logic of someone who has always believed he can talk his way out of anything, that the solution was a direct conversation with Warren Tate. Not through legal counsel, not as a formal negotiation, a private conversation between two men in a neutral location, in which Preston would offer to substantially improve Warren's circumstances in exchange for a conversation about how the documentation was being used. He did not describe it to himself as a settlement offer being delivered outside proper channels. He described it as resolving a legacy dispute. He asked his assistant to identify the location Warren most frequently appeared. His assistant told him it was a bakery on 5th Street. Preston had his driver take him there the following morning, without Meredith, without the security detail, without the communications team. He arrived at Briggs & Bloom at 8:45 in a lighter suit and pushed open the glass door. Fallon Briggs was behind the counter when Preston Hale walked in, and she recognized him immediately, from the video, from the coverage, from the particular quality of confidence with which he moved through spaces he had not been invited into. She did not greet him. She waited. Preston said he was looking for Warren Tate. Fallon said Warren wasn't in at the moment. Preston said he would wait. He sat at the small table near the window, the same table where Warren had sat 3 days earlier with his coffee and his practiced stillness, and placed a leather portfolio on the surface between them. He did not open it. Warren arrived 20 minutes later with Brielle. He had been at Sterling's office for the morning and stopped at Fallon's because it was on the way, and because Fallon had left a message saying there was a fresh cake with Brielle's name on it, no charge. He saw Preston's car through the window before he opened the door, the dark sedan, the driver standing outside, and he paused for a moment on the sidewalk, then pushed through and walked in. Preston stood and extended a hand. Warren looked at it briefly, then shook it. They sat. Brielle stayed near the counter alongside Fallon, and neither woman moved. They remained where they were, in the quiet companionship of people who have decided that what is about to be said should not happen without witnesses. Preston opened the portfolio. Inside was a single document, a formal settlement offer with a figure in the numbered terms on the first page. It was a substantial figure. Warren read it to the end, where the non-disclosure terms were outlined in careful legal language that translated, in plain terms, to take this amount, acknowledge the original dispute was fully and fairly resolved, and agree not to participate in any further proceedings relating to the matters described herein. He closed the portfolio and slid it back across the table. "No," he said. Preston's jaw tightened. "Warren," he said, "think about what you're walking away from. You've been living in a truck. You have a daughter who deserves more than this." Warren said, "She does, and she deserves a father she can respect." Preston said, "If this continues, real people lose their jobs. Not executives, the logistics workers, the route coordinators, the warehouse floor." Warren looked at him steadily. He said, "Those people's jobs are at risk because you built a company on numbers that weren't real. That's your record, Preston, not mine." Preston sat back. He looked at Brielle, who was watching from near the counter with the level attention of someone who had decided not to speak because she did not need to. He said, one more time, with the depleted authority of a man who has reached the last argument he has and knows it, "I'm offering you a way out of all this." Warren said, "I'm not in this. I'm not the one who built something on a lie." Preston was quiet for a moment. He picked up the portfolio, stood, and smoothed the front of his jacket with a gesture that looked, suddenly, less like authority and more like the thing a person does when they want their hands to stop showing that they are uncertain. He walked to the door. He paused with his hand on the glass. He did not turn around. Fallon set the replacement cake on the counter. Same white frosting, same yellow roses, Brielle written in careful cursive along the top, assembled the previous evening, because Fallon had been certain the moment would come when it would be needed. Warren looked at the cake. Then he looked at the door swinging shut behind Preston Hale. He said quietly, "Thank you, Fallon." Fallon said, "She deserves a good birthday." On the 6th day, the board of directors of Hale Meridian convened an emergency session at 9 in the morning in a conference room at the company's Century City headquarters, without Preston present for the first 40 minutes. By the time he was admitted to the room, the board chair had already outlined the company's legal exposure, the regulatory document request, the frozen credit facilities, the suspended investor commitments, and the conclusions of a preliminary independent review commissioned quietly over the previous 48 hours. The review's findings were narrow and technical, but unambiguous. The vendor contract structures, identified in the historical audit documentation, were materially consistent with the structures currently used in the company's revenue recognition methodology, and the probability that this consistency was coincidental was described, in the review's language, as not reasonably supportable. The board voted to suspend Preston's operational authority pending the completion of a full independent audit. He was permitted to retain his equity position, which was now worth considerably less than it had been 8 days earlier, and to remain on the board in a non-executive capacity, which meant attending meetings at which other people would make decisions about what remained of the thing he had built. He accepted these terms because his attorneys told him he had no viable alternative, and because the one thing Preston Hale had never been willing to do was acknowledge, clearly and on record, that he had built a significant portion of his company's valuation on figures that could not survive scrutiny. The independent audit, completed 3 weeks after the emergency session, confirmed the core findings of Warren's original report and identified additional instances of the same pattern in the company's more recent financial filings. The total discrepancy between reported and verifiable revenue across the company's operating history was a number that, when it appeared in the audit's executive summary, produced a specific kind of silence in the room where it was first presented. The company filed for emergency restructuring on the 7th day following the summit. Not a bankruptcy in the technical sense, but requiring the appointment of an independent oversight officer and the immediate suspension of all external capital activity, including the secondary listing that had been the centerpiece of Preston's expansion plan. The $2 billion valuation announced at the summit became, in the restructuring documentation, a figure described as not supportable under current audit findings. Meredith Langston cooperated with the regulatory investigation and provided her own documentation corroborating several aspects of the case, reducing her liability exposure in exchange, though her career in corporate communications did not survive the association. Gerald Marsh resigned and issued a statement saying he had raised concerns internally, on multiple occasions that had not been acted upon. A statement whose timing was strategic, but whose content the investigators found substantially accurate. Preston did not issue a public statement of apology for the financial irregularities. His attorneys advised against it. He issued no apology for what had occurred in the hotel entrance. No one advised him either way on that particular matter. It simply did not occur to him as an obligation, or if it did occur to him, it did not persist. Warren did not require one. He had not reopened the file because he expected an apology. Warren drove to Brielle's apartment on the evening of the 7th day, parked the Silverado at the curb for what he had decided would be the last time he slept in it, and carried the birthday cake up the 3 flights of stairs to her door. Brielle opened it before he knocked. She had seen his truck from the window. She looked at the cake in the box he was holding, white frosting, yellow roses, intact, and she said nothing, because there was nothing that needed to be said about it. They set it on the kitchen table. Brielle found 2 mismatched candles in a drawer, pressed them into the frosting, and lit them. They sat together in the small apartment near the hospital, in the quiet and the candlelight, sharing a cake on no occasion more dramatic than a daughter, and her father finally sitting down to the birthday that had been delayed. Brielle leaned forward and blew the candles out in one breath. In the brief curl of smoke rising in the still kitchen air, she looked at her father and said, "This is the first birthday where I didn't watch you make yourself small for anyone." 6 months after the Hale Meridian Investor Summit, the company that emerged from the restructuring process was operating under new leadership with a board-appointed director whose mandate was specifically focused on operational integrity and financial transparency. A compensation structure had been established for smaller investors and long-term employees who had held equity positions materially devalued by the restructuring, not adequate by most reasonable measures, but present, which was more than most restructuring outcomes managed to produce. Warren Tate was offered a formal advisory role in the new company's ethics and audit oversight framework. He declined the full-time position but agreed to serve as a periodic consultant on limited engagements, available when specifically requested, but not employed, not committed, not returned to the world of conference tables and corporate floors he had left involuntarily 9 years before. He had spent enough of his life inside institutions. He was not in a hurry to go back. Fallon Briggs's Bakery, in the months following the video and the news cycle, and the particular kind of attention that briefly attaches itself to small places when they appear in large stories, saw a sustained increase in customers, people who had read about Briggs & Bloom and made a point of finding it the next time they were in that part of the city. Fallon hired 1 additional person and replaced the convection oven she had been nursing along for 3 years with a used but newer model. She did not consider herself part of the story. She considered herself a baker who had given a man a small discount on a birthday cake and had then watched things unfold the way they sometimes unfold when someone has been carrying a truth for a long time and finally decides to put it somewhere it can be seen. Brielle helped her father move into a 1-bedroom apartment 2 blocks from the hospital, and she visited on Thursdays, the 1 day each week both their schedules permitted it. Warren kept the document box in the closet of the new apartment. Empty now, the folders transferred to Sterling's archive, the evidence in official custody. He kept the box itself. He had considered throwing it away more than once, had picked it up and held it, and each time set it back down. It was not a trophy. It was not a monument to what Preston Hale had lost or what Warren had recovered. It was a plain cardboard rectangle, slightly dented on one corner, the kind that holds a birthday cake, and he kept it because it was the last thing he had carried in both hands before he stopped being quiet, and he wanted to remember that the decision had come not from anger, not from strategy, not from any plan more sophisticated than a man looking at a logo and remembering who he used to be. Preston Hale had believed he was only grinding an $18 birthday cake into the floor of a hotel entrance. He did not know the man holding that box had spent years quietly keeping the documents that could bring a $2 billion empire down to its knees. And in 7 days, what collapsed was not just a company, but the certainty of a man who had never once considered that the people he stepped over might be holding something he could not afford to lose.